Kneel down. The command echoed through the marble foyer as Madam Kim poured a carafe of ice-cold water over Amina's 6-month pregnant belly. A maid who forgets her place is just trash to be discarded. Amina didn't flinch. She stood shivering in her damp Ethiopian cotton wrap, her eyes fixed, not on the floor, but on the hidden camera she'd installed in the chandelier. To the Kims, she was a penniless migrant who trapped their son. They didn't know that the beaded necklace they just ripped from her neck was actually a high-frequency transponder, currently pulsing a signal to a fleet of black SUVs crossing the Han River. They didn't know that the worthless girl scrubbing their floors had just finished uploading their entire illegal offshore ledger to the Interpol dark web. Suddenly, every light in the mansion turned blood red. The biometric locks hissed shut, sealing the Kims inside their own fortress. As the roar of a helicopter shook the roof, Amina finally looked Madam Kim in the eye and smiled. "My father is here," she whispered, her voice devoid of warmth. "And he's much less patient than I am." The scent of expensive pine wax and the bitter sting of bleach had become Amina's entire world. 6 months ago, she had arrived at the Kim estate in Seoul with nothing but a small suitcase and a heavy secret. Now, 6 months pregnant, she spent 14 hours a day scrubbing the floors of a palace that felt more like a mausoleum. Her husband, Min Ki, was a ghost. Once, in the highlands of Ethiopia where they met, he had promised her protection. But under the suffocating shadow of his mother, the iron-willed Madam Kim, he had withered. He now sat in the drawing room, sipping tea and looking away as his mother kicked Amina's cleaning bucket, spilling grey water across the foyer. "You missed a spot, African," Madam Kim spat, her heels clicking like a metronome against the tile. "Do you think because you carry a Kim child, you are a Kim? You are a vessel. Once that child is born, you will return to the dirt you came from." Amina kept her head down, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns of the Ethiopian beads around her neck, the only thing she had left of her mother. The audience sees a flash of a memory, a young Amina in Addis Ababa, watching her mother being forced into a black car by men with tattoos of a twin-headed serpent. Her mother's last words weren't a plea for help, but a command: find the lion in the east. Use the blood to find the truth. For 20 years, Amina had been a shadow. She hadn't just studied linguistics and finance, she had studied the anatomy of the Korean underworld. She knew that the Kim family weren't just tech moguls, they were the primary money launderers for the enemies of the Lim Syndicate. She hadn't met Min Ki by accident. She had tracked him to a coffee plantation, engineered their romance, and allowed herself to be brought home like a trophy wife turned servant. Every insult she endured, every night she spent sleeping on a thin mat in the laundry room, was a price she was willing to pay for access. As she scrubbed the floor, her hand moved with rhythmic precision. To the Kims, she was cleaning. In reality, her fingers were tapping a sequence into the pressure-sensitive smart tiles near the safe room. She was bypassing the mansion's mainframe. The emotion hits when Amina feels the baby kick, a sharp, sudden movement. She looks at her reflection in the polished marble. Her eyes aren't filled with the tears of a victim, they are burning with the cold fire of a strategist. She whispers a prayer in Amharic, not for mercy, but for the strength to finish the harvest she started. "Tomorrow is the anniversary," Amina murmured under her breath. "What did you say, girl?" Madam Kim barked from the stairs. Amina looked up, a terrifyingly submissive mask sliding back into place. "I said the floors will be shining for your guests, madam. Everything will be exactly where it belongs." She wasn't just talking about the furniture. She was talking about the reckoning. The morning of the Grand Merger Gala arrived with a suffocating tension that hung over the mansion like a thick fog. This was the day the Kims had spent years planning, a multi-billion-dollar union that would cement their name among the global elite. For Amina, it was simply the day the clock would start ticking. Madam Kim was in a feverish rage, her voice shrieking through the halls as she demanded perfection. "The silver must blind the guests, Amina. The floors must be like mirrors, she screamed, her face contorted with a mask of makeup and cruelty. Amina simply bowed, her eyes cast downward, hiding the flicker of a cold, calculating fire. While the household staff scurried to arrange exotic flowers, Amina moved toward the east wing. She carried a heavy bucket of soapy water, her gait appearing slow and labored under the weight of her pregnancy. As she passed the high-security server room, the digital brain of the Kim empire, she played her part perfectly. With a practiced slip, her foot caught the edge of a rug. She let out a soft gasp as the bucket tipped, a wave of gray water crashing against the base of the master security panel. "Oh no," she cried out, her voice high and trembling for the benefit of the overhead cameras. The guards rushed over, cursing her clumsiness. "Get out of the way, you stupid girl," one barked, shoving her aside to grab towels. Amina fell to her knees, apologizing profusely. In the chaos of the accident, her hand moved with the speed of a striking cobra. While pretending to wipe the floor, she reached under the panel's cooling vent and pressed a tiny, micro-thin bypass chip into the motherboard. It hissed into place, invisible to the naked eye. The mansion's fortress was now her playground. By evening, the gala was in full swing. Amina moved through the shadows of the kitchen, her maid's uniform a perfect disguise of insignificance. She waited until Madame Kim was occupied with a group of ambassadors before slipping into the private study. The room smelled of old cigars and stolen secrets. She moved directly to the safe behind the mahogany desk. Using a digital key hidden inside her Ethiopian beaded bracelet, the lock clicked open with a silent breath. She pulled out a thick, gold-embossed folder labeled Project Hijira. It contained the truth about the shipping routes her mother had been lost to. "What are you doing?" The voice was like a whip. Amina turned slowly to find Madame Kim standing in the doorway, her face pale with fury. The older woman marched across the room, her eyes landing on the stolen files. "How dare you touch this? You filthy, ungrateful thief!" Madame Kim shrieked. She lunged forward, her hand raised high to deliver a stinging blow to Amina's face. The hand never landed. Amina's arm shot up, catching Madame Kim's wrist mid-air. The grip was not that of a scared maid, it was a crush of cold, tempered steel. Amina's back straightened, her submissive posture vanishing as she stared down the woman who had tormented her. Her eyes, once soft and dull, shifted into the sharp, lethal gaze of a predator. For one terrifying second, the power in the room shifted. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Amina whispered, her voice a low, dangerous hum. "You have no idea whose blood I carry." The ballroom was a sea of glittering diamonds and forced smiles. The Kims moved through the crowd like royalty, convinced that tonight's merger would make them untouchable. At the center of the room stood Mr. Han, the CEO of the partner company, holding a fountain pen that cost more than Amina's annual salary. The billion-dollar contract sat on a velvet-covered table, waiting for the ink that would seal the deal. Amina watched from the edges of the room, holding a tray of crystal flutes. Her face was a mask of servant-like obedience, but her thumb was pressing a small button hidden on her cufflink. "Execute," she thought. Suddenly, a chorus of sharp pings echoed through the hall. It wasn't just one phone, every high-level executive in the room looked down at their screens at the exact same moment. Mr. Han's face turned from a polite smile to a ghostly white. His hands began to shake. "Is this a joke?" Mr. Han's voice boomed, cutting through the classical music. He turned his phone toward the Kims. On the screen was a live link to a public tech forum. The Kims' top secret smart grid patent, the very thing they were selling for $1 billion, had been leaked online for free. It was no longer a secret, it was public property. The value of the Kim Corporation evaporated in seconds. "The deal is off," Mr. Han roared, throwing the fountain pen across the room. "You are frauds. You can't even protect your own servers. The ballroom descended into chaos. The Kims stood frozen as their wealthy friends turned their backs on them. Amina quietly slipped away, moving through the service door into the dimly lit kitchen. The sound of the screaming upstairs felt like a victory song. A few minutes later, the door creaked open. Min-ki stumbled in, his tuxedo jacket rumpled and his face wet with tears. He looked small and broken. "It's over, Amina," he sobbed, collapsing against her. "My father is going to kill me. He thinks I let the security fail. Everything is gone." He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her shoulder like a frightened child. Amina held him, her touch soft and comforting. "It's okay, Min-ki," she whispered, her voice like honey. "I'm here. I've got you." But as she stroked his hair, she looked past him into the large industrial mirror on the kitchen wall. Her reflection showed no pity. With 2 fingers, she reached behind the lapel of Min-ki's jacket. She pulled out a microtransmitter no larger than a grain of rice, the wire she had planted on him the night he thought they were having a romantic dinner. She stared at her own cold eyes in the glass, crushed the device between her fingers, and smiled. The mansion felt like a sinking ship. Upstairs, the Kims were screaming at lawyers and tech experts, trying to find out who had leaked their secrets. They were looking for a high-level spy in a suit, never once glancing at the woman currently kneeling to scrub the wine stains from the ballroom carpet. Madam Kim stormed into the room, her hair disheveled and her eyes bloodshot. She needed someone to hurt. She looked down at Amina and saw the colorful Ethiopian beads peeking out from the maid's collar. With a snarl of pure hatred, she reached down and ripped the necklace from Amina's neck. "This is your fault." Madam Kim shrieked, her voice cracking. "You brought your bad luck and your filth into this house. You are a curse." She marched toward the tall glass doors leading to the garden. Amina followed, stumbling and crying out, "Please, madam. Not that. It's all I have left of my mother." It was a perfect performance. Amina fell to the grass as Madam Kim flung the beads with all her might into the center of the deep, dark koi pond. "Go fetch them, then," the older woman sneered. "Maybe the water will wash the smell of the streets off you." Amina sat on the edge of the pond, her shoulders shaking with fake sobs. Madam Kim laughed and walked back inside, satisfied that she had finally broken the girl's spirit. But as soon as the door clicked shut, Amina's crying stopped. She wiped her dry eyes and looked into the water. Deep at the bottom, nestled among the colorful fish and smooth stones, the beads did not just sit there. The water had completed a circuit. One by one, the hand-carved beads began to pulse with a faint, ghostly blue light. They weren't just jewelry, they were a powerful signal booster. By sinking them into the pond, Madam Kim had unknowingly placed a massive antenna right in the center of her estate, turning the entire mansion into a giant microphone for the Lim Syndicate. Amina stood up, smoothing her apron. The signal was now strong enough to bypass every firewall the Kims owned. She could hear the hum of the house's data being sucked away into the dark. Inside the study, the head of security was staring at a tablet with a look of pure terror. He didn't see the maid walking past the window with a calm, steady stride. He only saw the red lines on his screen. He ran into the hallway, nearly colliding with Madam Kim. "Ma'am, we've traced the data leak," the chief panted, his face pale. "Well? Which office was it?" she demanded, clutching her silk robe. The chief shook his head, his hands trembling. "It wasn't an office, ma'am. Our encryption wasn't broken from the outside. The signal is live. It's coming from right here. The hacker is inside the house." The mansion was a hive of buzzing panic. Security guards scrambled through the hallways, their heavy boots thumping against the floorboards as they searched for the phantom signal. Amina used the noise to her advantage. While the guards pushed toward the upper floors, she slipped through a service door that led to the restricted basement. To the Kims, this area was just a storage space for old wine and broken furniture. To Amina, it was a graveyard of secrets. She moved through the shadows with the grace of a cat. In the back of the humid cellar, hidden behind a false wall of stone, she found what she was looking for, a heavy, iron-bound vault. The Kims thought they had buried this part of their history forever. Amina placed her hand on the cold metal, her fingers dancing over the keypad. She didn't need a code, she had been memorizing the Kims' digital patterns for months. With a heavy thud, the door groaned open. Inside was not gold or money, but a single wooden box. Amina's breath hitched as she opened it. On top sat a faded photograph. It showed a beautiful Ethiopian woman with a crown of braided hair, standing beside a young, fierce-looking Lim Suk-jun. They weren't strangers, they were partners. As Amina dug deeper, she found a diary. The handwriting was her mother's. The words hit Amina like a physical blow. Her mother hadn't just vanished into thin air. She was the Black Princess of the Lim Syndicate, the bridge between two powerful worlds. The Kims, who were then just lowly bookkeepers for her father, had sold her out. They had betrayed her to a rival gang in exchange for the seed money to build their current empire. The very house Amina was scrubbing had been bought with the blood of her mother. A tear finally escaped Amina's eye, splashing onto the photo. The Kims didn't just hate her because she was a maid, they feared her because she was a living reminder of their greatest sin. They thought they had erased the Lim bloodline, but the blood had come back to claim its debt. Amina clutched the photo to her chest, her grief turning into a cold, hard diamond of rage. She had the proof. She had the names. She was ready to burn the world down to avenge the woman in the picture. I knew you weren't here for the laundry. The voice was low and sharp. The sudden sound of a metallic click echoed through the stone chamber, the sound of a hammer being pulled back on a pistol. Amina froze. She felt the cold circle of a gun barrel press firmly against the back of her head. The security chief stood behind her, his eyes narrowed in the dim light. He wasn't looking at a maid anymore. He was looking at a ghost. You've been playing us from the start, he growled. Who are you really? Amina did not flinch. Even with the cold steel of the pistol pressing against her skull, her breathing remained slow and steady. She didn't beg for her life or try to twist away. Instead, she closed her eyes for a moment, thinking of the vast highlands of her home and the power of the father who had been waiting for this moment. The lion sleeps in the shadow of the acacia, she whispered. She spoke the words in Amharic, her voice as calm as a summer breeze. The security chief stiffened. The gun didn't move, but the man's hand began to shake. Before he could speak, the heavy silence of the basement was broken by the sharp, rhythmic ringing of a phone. The chief reached into his pocket with one hand, his eyes never leaving Amina. The caller ID displayed no name, only a symbol, the twin-headed serpent of the Lim Syndicate. As he answered, a voice boomed through the speaker, so cold it seemed to freeze the air in the room. It was Lim Suk-jun. The chief's face drained of color, turning a sickly shade of gray. He didn't say a word, he simply listened, his posture collapsing from a hunter to a servant. He lowered the gun and clicked the safety back on. Without a word, the chief stepped forward and bowed until his forehead nearly touched the damp floor. He held the pistol out on his palms, offering it to Amina like a sacred gift. He hadn't been the Kim's loyal dog after all, he was a sleeper agent, a shadow planted by her father years ago to wait for the princess to wake up. "Forgive me, mistress," he whispered. "I had to be sure it was you." Amina took the weapon, her fingers wrapping around the grip with natural ease. "The time for hiding is over," she said, looking toward the ceiling. "Let the world see them for what they are." Upstairs, the Kims were attempting a desperate act of damage control. Madam Kim was standing in the grand foyer, surrounded by bright lights and cameras for a live TV interview. She was mid-sentence, claiming that the recent tech leaks were just a minor glitch, and that her family was a pillar of morality. Suddenly, a wave of notification sounds filled the room. It sounded like 1,000 birds chirping at once. Every reporter, every cameraman, and every guest in the house looked at their phones. A folder titled "The Real Madam Kim" had been airdropped to every device in the building. High-definition photos of her secret affairs, bank records of her embezzlement, and recordings of her mocking the poor flashed on every screen. The reporter looked at her phone, then back at Madam Kim with an expression of pure disgust. The live camera stayed on. In 60 seconds, the reputation Madam Kim had spent 40 years building didn't just crack, it vanished. The Kim family empire was no longer a palace, it was a cage. Outside, the gates were swarmed by reporters and angry investors. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of spilled wine and the sound of Madam Kim's hysterical screaming. They were ruined. Their bank accounts had been drained, and their name was now a joke to the entire country. "It's that girl!" Madam Kim shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at the kitchen door. "She is a jinx. A spy. We cannot leave the country with her dragging us down. If she stays, she talks. If she follows us, she is baggage we don't need." She turned to her son, Min Ki, her eyes wide and terrifying. "Do what needs to be done, Min Ki. For the family. Get rid of her." Min Ki looked at his mother, then at Amina, who stood silently by the counter, her hand resting protectively over her pregnant belly. He was a weak man, crushed by the weight of his mother's expectations. With a trembling hand, he grabbed a set of car keys and a heavy metal object from his father's desk. "Get in the car, Amina," Min Ki whispered, his voice cracking. "We're leaving. Just us." Amina followed him without a word. She sat in the passenger seat as they drove away from the bright lights of Seoul, heading toward the jagged, lonely cliffs that overlooked the dark sea. The car ride was silent, save for the sound of Min Ki's heavy, uneven breathing. He stopped the car at the edge of a steep drop-off where the wind howled against the glass like a warning. They stepped out into the cold night air. The waves crashed against the rocks hundreds of feet below. Min Ki turned to face her, his face pale in the moonlight. He pulled the gun from his pocket, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold it straight. "Why, Amina?" he sobbed, tears streaming down his face. "Why did it have to be you? My mother says you're the reason everything is gone. She says if I don't do this, we all die." He raised the weapon, pointing it at her chest. He was a man pushed to the absolute edge, a coward forced to play the role of a killer. Amina didn't run. She didn't scream for mercy. She simply stood there, looking at him with a gaze that was both pitying and incredibly cold. The wind whipped her Ethiopian wrap around her, making her look like a statue of an ancient queen. "You were always too weak to protect me, Min Ki," she said, her voice steady and calm despite the weapon leveled at her heart. "I'm sorry," he cried, his finger tightening on the trigger. "I'm so sorry." "Don't bother," Amina replied, taking a step toward him. She didn't look at the gun, she looked into his soul. "Check the chamber, Min Ki. I emptied it 3 days ago." Min Ki sat on the dirt at the cliff's edge, staring at his empty gun and weeping. Amina didn't look back as she climbed into the driver's seat of the luxury SUV. She drove back to the mansion with a steady hand, the time for playing the victim finally over. When she stepped through the front doors, she didn't head for the kitchen. She walked straight into the grand foyer, her head held high and her movements graceful. Madam Kim was throwing porcelain vases against the walls. "Where is my son? Why are you back?" she screamed, lunging toward Amina. Amina didn't flinch. She simply raised a remote device. With a single tap, the house began to groan. The smart home system, which Amina had spent months secretly reprogramming, suddenly took on a life of its own. Massive, Reinforced steel shutters hissed as they slid down over every window. The heavy oak doors locked with a series of loud, metallic clicks. "What are you doing? Call the police!" Mr. Kim shouted, grabbing the desk phone. He slammed the receiver down. "The lines are dead." He pulled out his cell phone, but there was no signal, only a red icon showing that a powerful jammer was active. The Kims ran to the front door, pulling at the handles, but the steel was immovable. Their mansion, once a symbol of their pride, had become a high-tech prison. They were trapped inside with the woman they had treated like dirt, and for the first time, they saw the terrifying truth in her eyes. Amina wasn't a maid, she was the warden. "You wanted me to be a ghost in this house," Amina said, her voice echoing in the vast, hollow space. "Now, you get to see what it's like to be forgotten." Madam Kim backed away, her face pale. "We have money. We can pay you. Just let us out." Amina didn't answer. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the Ethiopian beads she had retrieved from the pond. They were wet, but they were glowing with a fierce, steady light. She set them on the marble table in the center of the hall. Suddenly, every light in the mansion flickered and died. The grand chandeliers, the hallway lamps, and the garden floods all vanished into pitch-black darkness. The Kims screamed, stumbling over furniture in the gloom. But the room wasn't entirely dark. In the center of the foyer, the beads on the table began to pulse. A series of tiny, bright red numbers appeared in the air above the jewelry, projected by a hidden laser. It was a digital clock, and the numbers were rapidly ticking backward toward zero. The darkness inside the mansion was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic, red pulse of the digital timer on the table. The Kims huddled together in the center of the foyer, their expensive silk clothes damp with cold sweat. Every creak of the house made them jump. They were no longer the masters of this domain, they were trembling prey waiting for the unknown. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a low, vibrating hum that shook the floorboards. It grew into a thunderous roar as 20 high-powered engines pulled onto the gravel driveway. Through the cracks in the steel shutters, blinding white light began to pour in, slicing through the shadows. The roar died down, replaced by the synchronized slamming of 20 car doors. "It's him!" Mr. Kim gasped, his voice filled with a desperate, pathetic hope. "It's Lim Suk-jun. He's come to collect the protection money we owed him. He won't let his investment burn. He's here to save us." Madam Kim scrambled to her feet, frantically trying to fix her ruined hair. "Yes. He'll kill this girl and get us out of here. He's our savior." The heavy front doors, which had been locked tight by the security system, suddenly hissed open. The cold night air rushed in, carrying the scent of rain and expensive gasoline. A line of men in sharp black suits marched into the hall, forming a silent corridor. Then, a man stepped through the light. Lim Suk-jun, the legendary Korean Mafia boss, walked with a slow, terrifying power. His face was like granite, his eyes reflecting a lifetime of violence and secrets. The Kims threw themselves toward him, falling to their knees. "Lord Lim. Thank God you're here." Mr. Kim wailed, reaching for the man's coat. "This maid, this intruder, she's destroyed everything. Kill her. Save our family." Lim Suk-jun didn't even look down. He stepped over Mr. Kim's reaching hand as if he were avoiding a puddle of dirty water. He didn't look at the mansion, the broken vases, or the crying man on the floor. His eyes were locked on the woman standing in the center of the room. Amina stood perfectly still, her hands folded over her belly, her Ethiopian beads glowing softly against her chest. The fear that had defined her life for months was gone, replaced by an ancient, royal calm. Lim Suk-jun stopped inches away from her. The Kims watched, their mouths hanging open, expecting him to draw a weapon. Instead, the most feared man in Korea slowly lowered his body. He sank to one knee, bowing his head in total, humble submission before the woman they had treated like a dog. The room went deathly silent. Lim Suk-jun looked up at Amina, his voice thick with a respect that made the Kim's blood run cold. "The long night is over," he said, his words echoing through the hollow house. "The throne is ready, my daughter." The silence in the room was heavier than the darkness that had preceded it. Madam Kim looked as if she had turned to stone, her mouth hanging open as she stared at the Mafia boss kneeling before the woman she had called trash. Amina stepped forward, her heels clicking on the marble, a sound that used to signal her arrival to clean, but now sounded like a judge's gavel. She looked down at the Kims, who were still trembling on the floor. "You thought you were so clever," Amina said, her voice smooth and cold. "You thought you found a desperate girl in the highlands and brought her here to be your puppet. But I chose you. Out of all the families who betrayed my mother, you were the weakest. You were the greediest. You were the easiest to break from the inside." She placed a hand on the vault folder she had taken from the basement. "My mother was the Black Princess, the heart of the Lim Syndicate. You sold her to her enemies for a handful of silver to start your pathetic company. You thought you buried her memory, but her blood is standing right in front of you." Min-ki crawled toward her, his face a mask of confusion and terror. "Amina, the baby, my child." Amina looked down at him with eyes that held no love. "This child is not a Kim," she stated firmly. "This child is the unification of two ancient powers, the Lim bloodline and the royal line of Ethiopia. This baby is the heir to an empire you cannot even imagine. You were never a father, Min-ki. You were just a biological necessity to get me past the biometric locks of this house." The Kims gasped. Every moment of their lives for the past year had been a lie orchestrated by the woman they thought was beneath them. She had used their own home, their own security, and their own son to dismantle them. Lim Suk-jun stood up, signaling to his men. They stepped forward, their shadows stretching long across the walls as they surrounded the family. The Kims were trapped, stripped of their money, their status, and now, their dignity. Amina walked over to Min-ki. She reached into the waistband of her apron and pulled out a small, silver dagger, a traditional Ethiopian blade. She dropped it on the floor between Min-ki and his mother. The metal clattered loudly, the sound echoing in the high ceiling. "You spent your whole life doing exactly what your mother told you, Min-ki," Amina said, her voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "You even tried to kill me because she asked you to. Now, I will give you one final chance to be your own man." She leaned in closer, her eyes flashing with a predatory light. "Pick up the blade, Min-ki. Kill your mother and live, or stay a coward and die right here with her." Min-ki stared at the silver blade on the floor, his chest heaving. His mother's breath was hot and ragged beside him. Amina didn't wait for him to move. She walked over to the giant digital screen on the wall that usually displayed the Kim's stock prices. With a flick of her wrist, the screen hummed to life. "You lived your lives believing that money was your god," Amina said, her voice echoing through the cold hall. "So, I am going to show you what happens when your god abandons you." On the screen, a series of bank account numbers appeared. They were the Kim's secret offshore accounts, the millions they had hidden away to fund their escape. As the Kims watched in horror, the numbers began to spin like a slot machine, rapidly dropping toward zero. A digital receipt appeared on the screen, transfer complete. Destination, the Abiba Orphanage, Addis Ababa. "No!" Mr. Kim shrieked, reaching out toward the screen as if he could grab the vanishing numbers. "That's my life. That's 40 years of work. That is the price of my mother's life," Amina corrected him. "Every cent you stole is being turned into food and education for children who have nothing, children like the one I was after you destroyed my world. Your legacy isn't a tech empire anymore. It's a pile of ash." The Kims watched, paralyzed, as their entire history was deleted. Every house, every car, and every secret investment was being liquidated in real time. They were becoming nobodies in their own home. Amina watched them with a calm, steady gaze, her hands resting on her stomach. She didn't need to pull a trigger. Watching their souls leave their bodies through their bank accounts was far more satisfying. Madam Kim's mind finally snapped. The woman who had prided herself on being the queen of Seoul was now a beggar in a ruined dress. Her eyes rolled back, then locked onto Amina with a murderous, insane light. She spotted a shard of a broken crystal vase on the floor. "If I lose everything, you lose your life." Madam Kim screamed. She lunged forward, the jagged glass aimed directly at Amina's throat. Amina didn't move. She didn't even blink. But a shadow blurred in front of her. Min Ki, the man who had been a coward his entire life, threw himself into the path of the glass. There was a sickening sound as the shard buried itself deep into his shoulder. He let out a choked cry and collapsed to the floor, forming a human shield between the monster who gave him life and the woman he had failed to protect. Min Ki lay on the cold marble floor, his blood pooling around the shattered glass. His mother, Madam Kim, sat nearby in a daze, her hands shaking as she realized she had just struck her own son. Min Ki looked up at Amina, his breathing shallow and ragged. "I always knew," he whispered, coughing as he reached out a trembling hand toward her. "I knew you were too good for this family. I knew you were a queen, and I was just a ghost." He waited for a look of forgiveness, a single tear, or even a moment of regret. Amina looked down at him, but her face remained as still as a statue. There was no warmth in her eyes, no flicker of the maid who used to serve him tea. She was her father's daughter now. "You didn't know me at all, Min Ki," she said. "You only knew the mask I let you see." She turned her back on him, leaving his reaching hand to fall back into the red pool on the floor. Lim Suk-jun made a small motion with his hand. A group of men in dark jumpsuits stepped out of the shadows. They weren't carrying guns, they were carrying heavy orange canisters. The sharp, chemical scent of gasoline began to fill the grand foyer, masking the smell of expensive perfume and old secrets. "The Kims have lived in the light long enough," Lim Suk-jun said, his voice deep and final. "It is time for them to return to the ash." Amina walked slowly toward the open front doors. Behind her, she could hear the splashing of liquid against the walls and the desperate, muffled pleas of the people who had once treated her like property. She didn't look back. She had spent years planning this exit, and she wasn't going to waste a single second on pity. The house that had been built on her mother's betrayal was about to become a funeral pyre. As she stepped out into the cool night air, the first spark was struck behind her. A warm, orange glow began to grow in the windows of the mansion. The cleaners moved with silent efficiency, following her toward the line of black SUVs waiting at the gate. Amina took a deep breath, ready to step into her new life as the leader of the syndicate. But suddenly, a white-hot bolt of pain shot through her body. She gasped, doubling over and clutching her stomach. Her knees buckled, and she grabbed the door handle of the lead car to keep from falling. The heat of the fire roared behind her, and a different kind of fire surged within her. She looked down, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The revenge was complete, but the legacy was just beginning. "The baby," she gasped, her voice tight with a mix of agony and triumph. "It's coming. Now." 1 month later, the jagged ruins of the Kim mansion were gone. In their place sat a quiet, green park. The city of Seoul had no idea that beneath the fresh grass and young trees lay the ashes of a fallen empire. People walked their dogs where the ballroom used to be, never knowing that a queen had once scrubbed those floors while planning a revolution. High above the city, in a glass office that touched the clouds, Amina sat in a chair made of soft black leather. She was no longer wearing a stained apron or cheap plastic shoes. She wore a suit of deep emerald silk, and around her neck, the Ethiopian beads had been restrung with pure gold. Her father, Lim Suk-jun, stood behind her. The man who once ruled the underworld with fear was now a silent shadow, watching his daughter with pride. He didn't give orders anymore, he offered advice. The power had shifted. The student had become the master. In Amina's arms, wrapped in a blanket of hand-woven Ethiopian wool, her son slept peacefully. He was the bridge between two worlds, the heir to a throne built on both royal blood and street smarts. He was the only soft thing in a room filled with steel and glass. Amina looked down at the mahogany desk in front of her. A single manila folder sat there. She opened it, revealing the name and photograph of a powerful banking family in London. They were the ones who had funded the betrayal of her mother 20 years ago. They thought they were safe across the ocean. They thought they were too big to fall. Amina traced the photo of the London CEO with a manicured fingernail. A cold, predatory smile played on her lips. She had learned that the world's most powerful people were often the blindest. They never looked at the person cleaning their windows. They never noticed the person pouring their coffee. They never suspected that the nobody in the corner was the one holding the knife. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a simple, wooden feather duster, the tool of her old trade. She held it up, the feathers catching the light of the setting sun. She turned her gaze toward the window, her eyes reflecting the glowing city below. The Kims were just the beginning, she whispered. Her smile widened, sharp and dangerous. I think it's time for another spring cleaning. She looked directly into the glass reflection, her voice a chilling hum. Who wants to hire a new maid?